Great. Thanks, Pete. And thanks to Edinburgh Arts, anyone for having me. I should say two things just to protect myself at the beginning of this meeting. One is I am knackered after a long day at work, and the second is I'm not particularly familiar with the dynamics with the far right and reform in Scotland. So I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say about that. Um, I guess like the starting point is the kind of terrifying figure at the minute of reform leading the polls, which they have done in a recent YouGov poll, 20%, 24%. YouGov say that's within the margin of error, but um, I think when Reform are leading the national polls, that's fairly scary, regardless of whether it's in the margin of error, and something we need to think about quite intensively. Um, this is going to be a bit scrambled, but yeah, bear with me. I think the moment we're in is like a scary one. I think um, we can look at the actions of someone like Donald Trump, who's now the U.S. president, and we can see all sorts of constraints imposed on Trumpism. We can see where performance is striking out over real material reform, and we can see where the holes are in the Trumpist project. But I don't think we should be under any illusion about the moving of the dial that is happening at the minute politically, and I think we have to follow that carefully. I mean, at the last general election, uh, Reform may have only gained 5 seats, but it finished second in 98 constituencies, a runner-up in 60 northern seats, 13 Welsh constituencies, and immediately trailing Labour in a grand total of 89 constituencies. One of those is my own. And the last MRP that came out, which is like a big polling data sample, which looks at the best bit. It looks at tens of thousands rather than just like 1,000 people. Had Reform winning a lot of seats, particularly like my own in Stoke. The former Brexit party regularly now is trumping it in the polls, and I mean, we could see a situation where Reform would legitimately be competing for up to 100 seats at the next general election. When it comes to TikTok, something that I'm not especially au fait with myself, um, all the major parties trail Farage. Um, and this kind of complements Reform's relatively decent showing among 16 to 24-year-olds. And it just feels to me, at least, that the far right in the form of Reform is grabbing the moment by the horns, in a way that we're not. And in a way that the other political formations that dominate British society, the sort of two-party duopoly of Labour and the Tories, certainly can't. Um, and I think we could be seeing the first stages of Reform hegemonize the right as well. It was remarked upon on a chat thread that RS21 is a part of the other day, how small the recent London Nazi demo was comparatively to the one that just followed the pogroms in last August. Um, I think like you should be able to imagine that similar trends which happen between movements and politics on the left also happens between movements and politics on the right, which is that sometimes left movements exhaust themselves and are absorbed into politics. I think we saw this with the anti-austerity movements in Corbynism, for example, and sometimes a similar thing happens on the right when the energy of a movement and the energy of a political side in society is absorbed into one field over another. And I think we're seeing the absorption of the far right's energies on into the political sphere um, quite intensely. That's not to rule out the fact that that won't also give smaller fringe far right groups energy and a boost to do stuff on the streets. There's a list of demonstrations that have come out that are happening across Britain, and that's something that we're going to have to be aware of. I also think we should be clear. We should be seeing quite clearly how the rise of Reform is having like is already moving the dial on how other political actors in society think and talk. So some of you will have seen that in the Labour Party, there's been a kind of boost to the forces of Blue Labour. Blue Labour are kind of um, advocate a kind of defeatist, racialized, communitarian workerism they're quite hostile to migrants, talks in quite communitarian terms. That's had a boon. Someone who used to be on the left of Labour has now converted to Blue Labour, and also Labour have now set up this focus group to focus on the special problem that reform pose. That's organised by Morgan McSweeney, the chief of staff, Starmer's chief of staff, someone who's close to him. And so I think, even though none of us are under any illusion that Starmer is already incredibly racist and incredibly committed to border regimes, imperialism, and all sorts of horrible things that we oppose, we can always prepare for it to get a lot worse. And we can prepare for the Labour Party adopting some of reform's talking points. Um, there, there is a broader question here, which is about like the reorganization of politics at a moment when the two main parties are hollowing out in terms of their broader electoral vote and support that they're able to usher in and mount. Um, it first past the post makes it incredibly difficult for a outsider party to do well. The left has understood this quite harshly over the last 100 years in Britain, despite its recent breakthrough in the general election. Um, but I think we're in a moment of massive reorganization in British politics. We have been for the last decade and a half. And it seems to me at the minute that reform are the beneficiaries of that. That's not to say that this is the equivalent of 1922. In 1922, the Labour Party took over the Liberals. Um, and that was in no small part because of the expansion of the democratic franchise. We're not in the moment of the expansion of a democratic franchise. We're in a moment where more and more people participate less and less in politics because they see that it has less and less impact. And politics is a depoliticized field for most people, that they are told and reinforced and made to know that they can have no real influence over. And reform provides a kind of right wing route into that, and a right wing defiance of that. The name reform, the talk about getting rid of the House of Lords, outdoing Labour on the two-child benefit cap and nationalisation of water. I don't know if anybody saw the video that Farage did for Politics Joe, when someone asked him, "Don't you and Jeremy Corbyn have a lot in common, really?" And then he spent 2 minutes going into how him and Jeremy Corbyn had a lot in common. This guy is not a guy to mess about with. I think we should recognise that this is the most successful British politician, at least in my lifetime, and I'm 32 years old, and constitutes a real severe threat. And is quite clear that he wants to be the beneficiary of the reorganisation and decline of the British political sphere. As for Farage's politics, crucial to it is a notion that the British nation is in decline. That the British nation is and the British people, in scary quote marks, are being deliberately devalued. Farage says the family is being deliberately devalued. Broken down communities in the Rust Belt regions are being deliberately devalued. The concept of our national past and present is being thrown under the bus by a left liberal intelligentsia, setting up the duopoly of the two parties and kind of woke millennials as a kind of agent. Lee Anderson talks about raising a people's army. And you start to get a clearer sense of who the political subjects are in Farage's project. I mean, he talks quite openly, he speaks quite openly, and always has, to a kind of petty bourgeois reactionary politics. But he increasingly talks about Gen Z hard grafters against millennials, for example. And I imagine, given the amount of young people who are not taken to work employment or education and the big preponderance of economic inactivity, he's talking about Gen Z hard grafters against those elements of Gen Z who don't graft hard. So there's a politics of work to Farageism as well. And he talks about these people, and he talks about some of their issues, fed up with high energy bills caused by net zero policies. The cost of living crisis is because of an immigration fueled population explosion of 10 million people over 20 years. Again, using the language of this population explosion is devaluing British lives, British infrastructure, and British culture. So that's the kind of politics. There's also a separate thing about like the sort of body sovereignty that Farage talks about quite a bit in terms of wanting to get rid of the WHO from the influence of British politics, just like Donald Trump has just done when he's withdrawn from the WHO. So there's also there an intervention about how people reproduce themselves. And at the minute, the transition that they are in seems to be in raising a mass to organize branches and rallies to contest local and national elections and to develop a cadre, basically, who can evangelize within the areas that they live in. And this will be mixed. I think part of the problem of politics is that politics is very chaotic at the minute. It's very ungraspable. It's we don't live in the 20th century of mass political civil society organizations on the same scale that we did then. We live in a different, fundamentally different era. And there's a fragility to all politics in this moment. But Farage is currently the political force that is doing well to take advantage of it. And it sits within an ecology. The It's not clear to me that if the far right was as well organized and as militaristically disciplined as it was in the anti-war years, that it would be as successful as it currently is. As if it could hold together, it seems to benefit off the kind of fragile nature of politics in general. And there's just some of the stuff that these guys talk about again, like the crucial, and the left is really behind on this, and the left doesn't have a story to tell about this in many different ways, and if it does, it doesn't have a story that it communicates at a popular level. Is like Farage is absolutely insistent on politicizing the terms of decline, and all of that is geared towards a sort of racialized resentment against refugees, against migrants, the sort of specter of military age men that's always waged by the far right. Is just incredibly racist and terrifying for the ways that it incites the sort of violence that we saw in August of last year. It's an agenda which wages war on the woke, the educational establishment, the vilifying of trans children, and crucially, I think, in this moment of demographic decline, if you like, or demographic aging, however you want to phrase it, where society is just getting more older. They're very committed to sort of talking about a pro-natalist agenda. We should rewire back the dimes of the family. People should have more children. We need more traditionalism, and we need to boost the manosphere that we all see on our Instagram and TikTok and Twitter reels. So there's a politics of masculine uplift there, which I think is particularly targeted at younger Gen Z generations. And of course, it makes a claim over the politics of climate adaptation, about statist climate policy as authoritarian, and pitches itself as the only party prepared to truly fight for popular democracy. So there's a sense of what this organization is about, and what it is, how it's rising to the ascendancy in British politics. There's of course a case to be made that, and it's a very true case, that like the right benefits in a way that the left can't from a very conducive and friendly media sphere that amplifies it. Not just things like GB News that give like a daily channel into the far right's politics, but just in general, the main institutions of the media are much more open to the far right in their newsrooms than they are to the far left. And I guess one of the problems that I see in terms of our current approach on the left, and when I say this isn't to outright or to dismiss the history of anti-fascism, or even to dismiss that some anti-fascist tactics and strategies are completely necessary in particular moments in our time. But I have a sense, at least, that I think what we're doing, the way that we may treat reform like a typical fascist party, isn't necessarily working or going to work. Um, for I think for parts of the left, we can just do how we did anti-fascism in the past against the BNP or against the EDL with reform. We can highlight his city background on the leaflet. We can get trade unions to email stand up to racism bulletins to their members. We can protest at party conferences and meetings, and we can campaign against them at elections with no suggestion of something to vote for. And I'm sympathetic to lots of the people that do this work, frankly, and for the reasons why. But I do think it's inadequate for the moment. Because Farageism, whilst it emboldens fascist street movements of the kind that we saw in August, there's a synchronicity between the fact that Farage did so well in the general election and had that breakthrough, and the fact that 2 months later there are fascist riots on our street. Those two things are completely connected, and we have to be aware of that. But the politics of physical force confrontation, which in some places stymied the far right last year, will not defeat this iteration of the far right, in my opinion. Um, there's a question if anything it will play into their hands, allowing them to pose as the defenders of free speech and political democracy against an authoritarian left. Um, and I'm not trying to rule out street-based anti-fascism by any means. Like, I mean, when there are far-right Nazis marching through your area, you get out on the streets and you march against them and you defend your communities. But the task is bigger. We need a political agenda. We need something that's not simply reactive, but something that rebuilds politics. We need to develop forms of counterculture. We can't just think about the A&L. We have to think about Rock Against Racism at the same time. We have to think about how we change the political landscape of the ways in which people think, the habits, the thing that the far right are doing at the minute, which I think people are not processing as much as we should on the left. But a guy called Gabriel Winan in a kind of breakdown of the American election spoke to quite eloquently, is the far right and remaking human beings in their own image. As a friend said to me, the right, in whether it's Trump or Farage, have a sense of a felt imagined community. The left does not have that. We don't have a sense of a felt imagined community that we construct, and we certainly don't have a sense of a real community that we've constructed, as have been the defeats of the last 40 or so years. And I think part of the problem for our side is that you had loads of debates amongst leftists in the past where we talked about we have a crisis of leadership. If only we had the right leadership, we'd make it through and everything would be fine. But I think at the minute we have a crisis of subjectivity, which isn't to say that there aren't working class people who are organizing and fighting. We've had a mini strike wave. We had the BLM movement. We had this one of the biggest mobilizations, mass movements in British history in the last 18 months with the Palestine Solidarity movement, which was an incredibly, at least where I live, and I think elsewhere, an incredibly multiracial proletarian movement in lots of ways. But we still face with this question of a crisis of subjectivity where there isn't we don't have the same political subjects and political agents that drove radical politics in the way that we did in the past. And that needs to be, I think, at the center of the question of left strategy for thinking how we combat the right and how we rebuild our capacities and our sense of who we are and what we need to do as a class and as a movement. And I think it's very difficult at this point in the meeting, because this point in the meeting is when I'm expected to come up with practical claims as to what we should do. And I think the main thing is that we have to treat politics a bit like a laboratory. Gramsci talked about laboratories of hope. And I think we have to kind of take that spirit and that perspective about what are the initiatives that we can do to rebuild our class capacity and to rebuild senses of community and subjectivity that build a story, that rewire the way that people feel about this country and the world that they live in, and how we give people in our communities and in their workplaces and wherever we may be the tools to remake themselves and to remake the environment around them. Because the right is doing a good job at the minute. It may be febrile and fragile, but they're doing a much better job of it at the minute than we are. And that could include many things. Like, is there? is there like are there gigs and forms of counterculture that you can organize that encourage young people and people who don't have collective spaces, social spaces to come together? Um, are we moving beyond our usual crowds on the left, and are we building political spaces where like I read an article the other day by a guy called Joe Todd in Prometheus, where he talks about sort of relentlessly focusing on the hundreds of thousands of disorganized socialists that exist. Like that seems to me like an interesting starting point. Like what are the venues and the forums that we can build where we can get those people in the room? We can rebuild our sense of who we are and our agency and just our basic mass, the amount of people who can do stuff and organize and think together. Um, and I think, the one of the big questions that underlies a lot of this, and I'll close it up on this because I'm interested to hear what you guys think, um, is there is a question of organization fundamentally, which is that lots of us are in RS21, some of us may be in different organizations, but we can't escape the question of like there isn't a mass political project of the left in British society. Um, and we need to be thinking in those terms. I think we're in a bit of a limbo as the left at the minute. The general election happened. You saw these 5 independents get elected, and a historic breakthrough in the history of the British state, something that's not happened before. Most of the people that got elected, for example, as Communist Party MPs, got elected affiliated to the Labour Party still. So this is a historic breakthrough, but we're kind of waiting to see what happens out of it and to see if someone else will form a party. Now, I'm not saying we can all go and form our own party, but maybe the thing is that in our communities, in our spaces, we need to try and sort of create the precursors to what a local party might look like, where we can bring people together bigger than ourselves. We can talk about the problems that we face. We can work out how to organize. We can map the strategy for going forward and who is going to carry out that strategy and how we build a culture and a sense of community around that. Because the concern of Farage is a big concern. I don't necessarily think that Farage is going to win the next general election, at least not in terms of seats. The first past the post electoral system negates that, but he could well win the popular vote. And the question then beckons of what we do when Farage is the kingmaker in British society. I'll leave it at that.